Hello and welcome to CTOs at Work podcast series. In this podcast series, we talk to technology leaders from all around the world and learn from them how they build and manage world-class technologies and product, how they groom their people, how they build the foundation of successful organization, and many more interesting topics we covered in this podcast. And today we have a very special guest with us who has led and built the core foundation of Amazon's worldwide transportation systems, who has authored more than dozen of commercial product and has four patents, whose work has been featured in on the Discovery Channel and in numerous other magazines like PC Gamers, Video Games, and many others. And currently, he is playing his role as a chief technology officer for Quiet Logistic and Airterra. And he is Mr. Charles Griffith. And there is so much to talk about Charles. I think he has done great contribution in the entire product and technology ecosystem in his last 35 plus years of experience. And because of his great work, he has considered as a the inspirations for many people around the world. And Charles has helped many companies like Amazon, IBM, First Data, and various other venture-backed organizations. In fact, at Amazon, Charles led the transportation technology from the launch of the Prime, and now Amazon is known as a global leader in the logistics space. And there are so many interesting things Charles has done, starting from his own startup and raising a good amount of fund, and the company got acquired later, and many other interesting things. So with that context, I would like to welcome Charles. So hi Charles, I'm so happy and so proud to have you on my show today. And there's a one interesting thing, because I'm so glad to have you on the show, because I met you almost a 10 years back in India when you are representing Amazon. So it was a really inspiring talk at that point of time.
Thank you, love. I appreciate that. I think that was in Noida, right?
Oh yes,
Um,
absolutely. That was in Noida, right?
yes, quite a night. That was very exciting. Early days, although at that particular point we were winding down my career at Amazon. Certainly a lot of fun.
Great, Charles. Yeah, it was an amazing event. Yeah. And now, for the benefit of our audience, Charles, it would be great if you can give a glimpse of your career journey. So, how you climb your career ladder and have done so many amazing things.
Sure. So I think I'd say really I've gone through multiple journeys. I started off in games. During that particular time, a lot of those publications that you mentioned were, tied to various games I worked on, most of them extinct platforms at this time, things like the Amiga, the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, etc., and building games and home entertainment, products at that particular point. About 10 years in, you start to feel like a very old man in that industry. It's really a young person's industry. And I started to look at and reflect. I tried a couple of startups in the gaming industry and done some things specifically for various companies. And I'd learned a lot about myself and the gaps that I had. So over the next course of 10 years, I really went to about trying to fill in those particular gaps by focusing on different verticals. I looked at things like CAD initially to move away from games and then into some of the emerging e-commerce and retail, and then moving on to other areas like payments, security, and ultimately landed on another startup that I was working on specifically around manufacturing CRM for retail. In fact, for garment manufacturing, which is interesting, as here I am again, another 20 years or 10 years later. During that particular time, I learned a lot about the distribution problems and the challenges of communicating with different partners across a very complex supply chain. And it was probably during that particular time that I got this infection of supply chain logistics, and a company called Amazon came calling, and I said, that's probably a good place for me to go and learn. And sure enough, it was. That's about the time I joined Amazon. I went in, and as you mentioned, at that time, Prime was literally only a year old. It was really more aspirational than actual. So we figured out how to effectively exploit carrier networks to get that 2-day coverage at a discounted rate. And along the way, we went deeper and deeper into carrier networks and did deeper and deeper injection, added more and more carriers, and then ultimately arrived at the point where we started to see Amazon's volume eclipsing what carrier networks could support in different geographies. And at that particular point, it became obvious that if Amazon was going to be an effective supplier to its own particular marketplaces and its own particular sellers, it was going to have to start becoming a carrier. And that's really when we started that journey that you mentioned at that point. So after about another 3 to 4 years in that space, we launched um, many different end products that customers rely on today. The initial rollout of Fresh was expanded into California. We did Last Mile in the UK. We launched India using a lot of the same technology. We built out sort centers, which was one of the first things that Amazon was able to build exclusively with a team from Hyderabad. It was one of the first very high availability systems built from cradle to launch from India. And of course, other components of that network, like the middle mile management and others. About 2014, I decided, either I was going to die at my desk at Amazon or I was going to give another shot to doing a startup. And at that point, that is when I created Mile Zero, went out, raised capital, and went on that journey of building out, a last mile platform, which ultimately, with a lot of pain and blood, sweat, and tears in between, ultimately went on to support Staples in the U.S., Harvey Norman in Australia, Endeavor Drinks, and others, and is now supplying grocery delivery to customers in different areas, and continuing on with a company called Capstone Logistics, which acquired it. And then, of course, at a certain point earlier this year, I decided that I couldn't pass on this opportunity to be part of Quiet, and something that we're doing that is very much as our driving force. Shaker Najran says is kind of the antithesis of Amazon, which is uniting all of the retailers to build a common platform that really lowers that barrier of entry to providing great retail services for all. And that's what brought me here today.
Oh, that's great. That's really amazing, inspiring. A lot of
Thank
from
you.
gaming to retail to manufacturing to logistic. I mean, this is a great journey. You have seen the entire landscape and holistic world through these technology lenses. That is amazing. And
If you're around
so,
long enough, love, you'll do all kinds of things. Trust me.
so now it's mile zero, which you started, right? So as because mile zero was your entrepreneurial, uh, dream to make this happen, and definitely it got us, successful creation of that product and technology, and then raising of funds as well. So how was your experience as a CTO with mile zero as compared to what you did in Prime?
So I think there's a pretty broad contrast, and then there's a number of things that are very much the same. Um, I'll start with the things that are the same because I think those are repeatable patterns that all the way back to my gaming days, I've carried forward with me and found, very similar things happening at Amazon when I arrived there. And that is building with small teams and building those teams such that they have ownership and that they have very high caliber individuals, not necessarily all senior, but certainly driven with the drive and autonomy to create. That is the piece that I think is common throughout all of my journeys, including with Mile Zero. I was fortunate enough to bring along a number of people that I had worked with in the past from Amazon and a few other places, and that certainly brought a very common connection when you bring a team that's already like-minded in terms of how they can interact, how they can be tough on each other, and really inspire each other to move to something historic. It makes things a lot easier to acquire or to accomplish big tasks. And I think that the things that were very different, though, are certainly building from nothing and having to carry that budget and continue that through hard times. Mile Zero started in 2014 and was ultimately acquired, as you said, in 2019. In between, there were some lean years. Um, Back in 2014, really the only other significant startup in that space was really Deliv, and they had just gone through a second round of fundraising. It was very tough at that time as a supply chain company or an enterprise retail tech company to get funding, because the focus was on things like Snapchat and social networking. So it was a time where you had to do a lot of education, you had to do a lot of convincing to various investors, and I felt like I was doing a lot of teaching for people that were coming to an understanding to see, what is the space and is there something here to invest in. Um, but some of the things that you learn during that time is also how to find a focus point and how to drive that product relentlessly with the team, how to grow that team. Those pieces do repeat throughout my career, but I think that total product ownership is something that a startup gives you that's truly unique and very exciting. It's something that every technology person should either be a part of or try to create before their journey's done.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, so in that role, so CTO has to play a many different heads, like the product manager head, the CTO head, engineering head, and as an entrepreneur, you're going out and raising fund, representing your startups. Amazing. That's fantastic.
I would
So
say, in addition to those, Love, the things you don't think of in that role are you have to be a recruiter, right? Because you're
mm,
starting from
yes,
nothing. You have to have a lot of financial insight, right? Some of the lessons I learned from working in payments and some of the other companies, right? That total ownership of the business is another piece that people are generally not prepared for. And I find, nowadays there are a lot of incubators and ways that founders can get some of that support from the portfolio companies and portfolio investment companies that are supporting them with some of those auxiliary services. But I think it's always better that you come in with a sense of total ownership, because that way you're able to maximize that investment and ultimately be a better guide for your own success.
yeah, that's great. And in fact, the logistic space, as you talk about, as compared to what it was way back in 2014 and 15 time, and the post-pandemic world. So the post-pandemic time has brought a lot of attention into this logistic and supply chain ecosystem, as entire world has realized that okay, now this is the backbone of everything. If this works perfectly fine, then everything goes fine. And that's how I see, there are huge investments are happening around in terms of making these companies digitally transform, and a lot of new interesting products are also coming in this space.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is really it's very difficult for retailers, right? I think we're almost headed for another round of extinction for a lot of retailers if they don't figure things out. Of course, early on we saw the first wave when companies didn't modernize and invest in e-commerce, right? And then the next round really came as some companies got better at it, but we had a number of significant economic issues, right? Like 2008, that big recession, and some of the things that did to the overall consumer base. But you're right, COVID has really accelerated that demand for home delivery, right, and for faster shipping. If it wasn't for the Amazons of the world, many of us would have been in really sorry shape during lockdown. So I think that's really continued through, hopefully we're coming out of COVID, knock on wood, but it has accelerated, and there's no going back in terms of that demand for instant, immediate delivery. And what that's doing in terms of retailers is it's focusing the need to become supply chain experts. And much of what we see is very similar to what we saw, prior to cloud computing, where, every company was building their own network and spending a lot of money with Sun, much to the, delight of Sun, building out networks that they would never ultimately be able to leverage or utilize, but it was required to be able to compete until the entire industry was disrupted with cloud computing. I think that's what's happening right now, again, with supply chain. Companies simply can't invest that much in warehouses, in carrier relations, and integration, and ultimately getting the kind of distribution, especially in countries like the U.S., to get to a next day network, let alone same day, as companies like Amazon continue to push. So that's really one of the drivers that excites me about what Quiet is doing here, where we're providing the ability for everyone to kind of contribute your network and join it, much like an internet of supply chain.
Yeah, that's great. And Chaz, I think for the benefit of our audience, it would be great if you can talk about a brief about what exactly the quite logistic and Air Terena, and what is your focus on the holistic from the technology landscapes.
Right. So um, we're a very interesting experiment, right? It's something that you don't often see, where a retailer can make a very strategic decision, which I credit completely to Shaker Najran, who came in and drove this idea of disrupting AEO and building a supply chain company within a retailer. It's truly a unique experiment, something that I've never seen before, and something I think that is not likely to happen again, because it's taken an alignment of so many different things and so much expertise to really arrive on that objective. But that said, what we've done is we've started by pulling American Eagle's ability to fulfill packages into a separate entity. We acquired two companies. One was called AirTerra, which was a super highway for retailers to, with fulfilled products, to effectively zone skip across the U.S. Obviously, it costs a lot more to inject into a major carrier if you're going from, say, New York to Los Angeles. So AirTerra would solve that by providing a super highway to connect those two coasts and inject into the carrier closest to the customer destination. Something very much like I described early on in the Amazon journey that we did. The other acquisition was Quiet Logistics, which is a company that's been around for quite some time, over 10 years. A very effective third-party logistics company when we acquired them, that had a number of different facilities, robotics-assisted picking, very modern. If you take a look at some of the footage, it looks a lot like an Amazon warehouse. And what we've done since then is combine those together to create a connected network. We've connected those buildings with that carrier movement. We've overlaid a series of capabilities like inventory management, so that you can position inventory effectively. And now what we've also started to do is bring in other retailers into this network, and begin to increase the volume and the capabilities to benefit all. Along with other providers, like other warehousing providers and other freight providers. So where we're moving and what we're ultimately doing is building a supply chain network that allows everyone to contribute their assets and stop doing what I said before, which is to continue to go bankrupt by buying more warehouses, integrating more retailers, investing in more retail tech, and effectively joining a system where they can maximize what they have and achieve reach and pricing in a more on-demand model.
Hmm. That's quite interesting. Yeah. it is enabling the entire network together so that everybody can leverage everything, and holistically the business can get the maximum ROI.
Correct, because at the end of the day, most retailers are on the end of the spectrum where they can't be like an Amazon and have hundreds of facilities, let alone different segments of facilities like FCs, delivery stations, sort centers, prime pop-ups and stores, et cetera. Those fixed costs are a once in a lifetime thing where we're not going to see that repeat again. We call that a private network. That's something that is very hard to replicate, very expensive, and takes a lot of technology investment. So Amazon is very much on their own, and that leaves other retailers questioning how do they catch up, how do they even achieve parity. And so this is the idea of everyone teaming up together to effectively get to the greatest common denominator.
Wow, that's fantastic. And as shipping and logistic industry, as one of the larger industry of the producer of the data, if we talk about in terms of industry who are producing large volume of data, so shipping and logistic is definitely one of them. And as most company around this logistic and cargo industry are headed towards having to deal with exabytes of data, so what is your advice on setting up strategic data foundation now to future proof such kind of organizations?
It's one of the first problems I looked at, especially when you talk about acquisitions, and when you talk about a set of disparate entities like multiple retailers, right? The hardest thing to do is unify data. And it's very important to honor multi-tenancy and keep that data isolation. So one of the first things we focused on was really building a supply chain data cloud. Um, we chose to work with Snowflake. It's something that we'll have a press release out at some point soon. But we're really focused on providing real time, immediate data across a number of systems. So that in addition to building a data cloud and unifying that data, I think the next thing is really to break the silos that are inherent with things like supply chain. One of the things we've heard now for the last 2 years through COVID, right, is all of this concept of disconnected, right, silos, whether we're talking about the arrival of containers to ports, right, there's no visibility. Retailers have responded by overbuying this year, I would say we're going to see as an industry. So there's all of this disconnected data that is causing poor decision making. So one of the first things to do is to get a good data strategy, put it in put the same kind of effort you would put into any other kind of cloud architecture, and figure out how to make it immediate, make it consistent, and keep it secure.
Yeah, that's great, right? And as part of this holistic data strategy, so how these tech leaders need to consider, as in they need to choose a cloud option, they need to go for a platform as a service providers, because if we talk about the this industry, because uh, I a few months back I was interacting with one of the customers. They are a big liner from Norway, and they have huge this ecosystem, many different disconnected systems around around there, and they have a way to manage that. Uh, but what should be the best way so that because these disconnected system would stay, they used to stay and they will stay forever.
Absolutely. I think that's a good, line in the sand to start with, right? You're not going to cause everyone to upgrade, right? Um, I'm pretty sure there's still a, desktop out there running Windows 95. You can just never get everyone to upgrade. So I think that the thing to focus on is what you can do, and that reconciliation of data is the place to focus. I think it comes down to also having a good strategy in terms of what is it you're trying to achieve. A lot of people do a lot of this data unification with no vision and no product in mind. In our particular case, we're not just collecting data without a particular endpoint. We're looking at a set of insights that we want to be able to surface, and that allows us to triage and prioritize the data that we want to import into this data cloud. So it's good to think of data as a product or a series of products as well. I think the next thing is to there are just a plethora of different solutions out there for transforms and for publishing. There are many different publishers available for driving and connecting various types of databases to Snowflake as an example, just to continue on what we did. There are a number of different enterprise um, integration layers like MuleSoft that can do data transformations and can bring files and so forth into data sources. So there are a variety of ways to get there. I think though you start with what is the problem you're solving, and then you work backwards from that to how do I aggregate the data, where does that data live, and how can I get kind of a cradle to grave view, because I think when you don't have integration across systems, data can be that unifying layer that can give you that visibility and control.
Yeah, yeah, this is quite interesting, right? They need to look at this data as a data product. So holistically, they need to look at as a holistic suite of this data product, and there are small data products are sitting around the whole ecosystem.
Absolutely. And
Yeah,
and I
that's
think it's an ecosystem as well, just like we talked about an ecosystem for supply chain, right? If you start to apply machine learning and other techniques, you can get insights. And the other concept to keep in mind is time to live, and the value of that data in terms of immediacy. Just like we talked about for customers with deliveries, analysts, whether it's a financial analyst looking at the health of the company, or whether it's a transportation operator inside of a supply chain, getting that information in real time versus 10 hours later, like legacy systems, is critical. So I think that becomes another piece that should shape that product, right? It's not necessarily getting every insight as much as getting what you need to be able to solve the problem quickly.
wow, that's great. That's a great, absolutely a fantastic piece of advice. Great. And now connected to this, definitely uh, the team structure and the recruiting strategy also plays a very important role. So what's your advice, and what is your take on when we form about this entire ecosystem, right? What should be the ideal team structure, or what is your current team structure is?
So I think there are a couple of different ways to go, right? When I started a startup, even though I had fairly significant funding, you never have enough, right? When you start to think of all of the costs, infrastructure, and so forth. So in that particular case, I built from a model of, how do I build this core team, and how do I effectively, it's more like building a cricket team or a baseball team, right? How do I fill the respective positions with the best players I can get? Because of course you're competing against the big guys that have more money and can effectively land the top tier people. So you try and work within those constraints to get the best team on the field. In what I'm building now with Quiet, it's a much different experience for me, again, because I'm able to access a lot of my team from the past. I feel like I'm putting out there my own NBA All Stars team. I've had a lot of success in terms of bringing back a lot of my leaders, and that comes back to relationships, right? Managing those relationships over time and building trust. But again, at the end of the day, the pieces that are the same are really, you want to create these small ownership groups. You want to put strong leaders driving those, and then you want to build around those leaders with very autonomous, high bar people that not necessarily have equal amounts of seniority, but have the same bias for delivery, have the curiosity to learn, and have that drive to do something historic. I think if you follow those patterns, you end up with a very good team. You will have conflict, right? If you're hiring the best and you're basically putting them together, it's just like a kinetic mixture, right? Many times everyone's moving quickly. There's going to be times where people rub others the wrong way. And that's part of your job as the orchestrator or as the CTO, is how to effectively manage people to the same direction, and how we make the right compromises and decisions as a team.
Okay, pretty interesting. So that's pretty interesting. And in terms of your, team and recruiting and hiring, which is known as the worldwide challenge right now for every company around the world. So, what is your core challenge around that area?
You know, I actually believe that a lot of people are very lazy. They outsource decisions, right? Very much like retailers used to outsource decisions to carriers, and now they're more integrated in the process of delivery. I find managers outsource decisions to recruiters, right? And then they complain about the lack of response. There's not one person in your listening audience that can't get on LinkedIn and reach out to people and figure out how to network like you do, and find people for roles. I find that many times people set their bars low, right? They won't aspire to get the best person they can find. They'll aim at somebody they think they can land. And I think that those two things, having that autonomy to reach out and just make somebody curious about the problems that you're solving, is one of the ways you can break that down. And it's one of the things that startups are able to do that distinguishes them from your typical large scale company that goes through a hierarchy for hiring, and it's a very long lethargic process. The other thing that I think is important is the way that you interact with candidates. um, what I like to do is for us, obviously we're trying to validate functional skills, but we're also trying to do it in a way that it resembles what you would do in the job. So if you can do things where you're doing problem solving within a scenario that's similar to what you would solve, actually doing the job, it's much more inspirational to somebody that's joining versus having to do another O of N for a sort algorithm, right? Or something very dry and repetitive that every tech company does. So there are a lot of ways to solve this. It's be creative and challenge yourself to really think as a recruiter, or as an advocate for the candidate, is what I tend to look at. Um, so I think it's laziness, is my opinion, why people have hiring problems.
That's great. Yeah, yeah. I think that's the great crux of entire. The gimmick of the organization can be, they can take move much faster. If this outsourcing of decision can be effectively handled by these managers. Yeah, I've seen many instances. Actually, I can relate that. Definitely, that's a great one.
It's a very typical pattern, and honestly, it wasn't until Amazon that I really realized how important that was. Right, I'd certainly hired from my network for previous roles, but Amazon really crystallized that idea of every manager being their own recruiting manager as well. Although we had recruiters and so forth, it was really a function of the job to do interviewing and to hire. And in fact, having been a bar raiser at Amazon, that takes it another level of where you're looking at how to do consistent and fair hiring across multiple different teams, and how you instill a certain bar across an organization. So there are a lot of there's a lot of online material about Amazon's bar raiser culture that I would recommend people go back and look at as they're building a culture for their own company. It's a great pattern to replicate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love Amazon's leadership principles. That is really, really, great. In fact, I was consulting one of the client, and their hiring strategy, the entire hiring process, was built on top of the Amazon leadership principles. Although
Absolutely.
they inherited it, they renamed it, but
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of hiring, actually recruiters would be assigned competencies to interview for. In addition to the functional skills, you would get a, problem solving or bias for action, and the evaluation would actually relate back to those as well, because a lot of it wasn't just can you find the best, in the case of engineering hiring, the best engineer, but can you find the best engineer for this particular culture? And it's really because, Amazon was built on this concept of fungibility, right? You don't want to hire specialists because ultimately, what happens if the company stops doing that particular thing? That person's no longer needed. And what are you going to do with them? You're going to end up laying them off. And while a lot of people may think of Amazon as a throwaway type of culture, it really was not. It was really how to build that kind of leadership and growth in every individual that they brought on. It was something that went from Bezos level down. He was very focused on retention, and it was something that they focused on long before um, they got a bad rap on it from some of the FCs and so forth, because it is a very tough culture as well.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Great. So I think now that's a good segue to my next pattern of questions, which is more on understanding the aspect based on your own real life experiences. So one definitely an interesting topic which our audience actually love to listen is the aha moment, right? And another one is war story. So I'll come to the war story later. So what was your aha moment, Charles?
I think early on as an engineer, and many engineers go through this, it becomes, yeah, I love to code. I love to do this, right? I'm doing this 24/7, so I better love it. But is there more, right? What do I truly want to accomplish? And once you go through that epiphany and you start to say, well, in order to get there, I need to go back and get these other skills. And how am I going to do it? Because, of course, I've still got to support myself, or depending on when you have that moment, you might be supporting your family. There's not that opportunity necessary to go back to school. So you're going to have to figure it out on the job. So a lot of what I did, as I mentioned, different times in my career, I would take an assessment. Really, I do it to this day every 5 years or so. I look back and I say, am I on the trajectory I want for the next 5 years? Right. And I look back and I say, well, perhaps as I looked back at Amazon, I might have stayed longer than I anticipated. Right. I think it was still valuable because of the pieces that I was able to influence and deliver. But every one of these, I kind of give myself a scorecard, and then I say, what is it I really want to get to next? And do I have the skills to do it? And then I will kind of chart out over the course of those next 5 years what positions or what kinds of roles I need to pick up. And I think when I learned that, I moved from being very stagnant and kind of that senior engineer role to doing something much more meaningful, at least for me, where I could still stay technical and still go back and forth, because I bounced back into that engineering role intentionally multiple times throughout my career where I felt like I'm getting too far away from it. I need to get back into the trenches. But I wouldn't be able to get to a leadership role where I am today if I hadn't had that type of epiphany, and then aimed for different companies, pushed myself to uncomfortable positions where I didn't feel many people have this syndrome of this imposter syndrome where they feel like they've been overplaced. I've had that many times, and it's because I'll take roles where I'm not sure I can do it. That's part of the reason I'm taking it. I don't want to do status quo. I want to continue to build my skills as an individual, and I want to do something different in each of those roles. So I think that's a good life lesson for anyone that's starting their career. If they can move that moment up, that epiphany earlier, they're going to get much farther than I've gotten. So,
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's really great piece of advice. Yeah, if you look back, take your reflections, and then decide what next coming up for 5 years. That is really great. Yeah. And now moving to another interesting topic, which is a fail. Any challenges or any war story you want to share?
oh, I've got so many. If we look back, there's so many failures I could speak to. I think I'll pick one that's right on the cusp, since we're entering into retail peak. there was a service that was part of my team at Amazon. And the way that Amazon worked at that particular period of time is we had a war room for all what we would call Sev 1, or not Sev 1, not Sev 1. We're getting to the Sev 1 in this story, but what we would call Tier 1 services, services that effectively were part of, you know, if there was any kind of drop in that service, it could create a 25% order drop. That's a Sev 1 in Amazon terms. So any of those particular services were part of this organization where we would go through and we go through, we'd already be well into it now before retail peak, talking about, do we have the capacity? Have we scaled the services? Do we have the visibility in the dashboards to monitor? In fact, as Amazon got more and more mature, they'd run random events to test teams, which we would call game days, to see if teams were really prepared for various outage scenarios. But this was earlier on. And so one of the services I owned was one of those tier one services. And we got to, I can't recall if it was Black Friday or Cyber Monday, but it was one of those 2 days, right? And on those days, every single minute makes a huge difference in terms of revenue for Amazon, as you can imagine. Even, now it'd be unthinkable how much that could possibly be. Think back, 15, 20 years ago, what it was like. It was still very high. Well, we happened to have one of those services that tipped over and, stopped supporting volume and created a Sev 1 order drop. And it becomes all hands on deck. And you get the attention of every senior leader in the company when that happens on the most important day. Ultimately, there were actually a few different services that collapsed at that same time, but we ended up owning the what you would call a correction of error, a COE, a document that looked at what was the issue, what was the timeline, and then a section called the 5 whys. Why did this happen? Why did this? Each of those 5 whys was used to tell the story of what caused this event and how could it have been avoided and corrected. And then from this particular review, there would be a set of action items. Now, it was at a time where many services, they didn't want to be in that tribunal and getting that beating under any circumstance, right? Because they took it as a punitive action, but we took it as an opportunity, to be honest, to explain what happened. In fact, the reason we failed was a math error in terms of how much hardware we had calculated we needed. And that actually introduced a number of other cascading issues, why we couldn't get the hardware fast enough, why we couldn't bring it up, and a number of other things. And ultimately, as we walked through this, what ended up happening, as always did with these COEs, is we educated a number of other teams that were lucky, that had too much capacity. We basically exposed a number of things where Amazon could focus, and these types of lessons would make Amazon more resilient. But they also had another impact that leaders, don't necessarily realize. When you're in that situation, you don't realize it's just like the kid that gets called on in class with, a class of 500. There are a lot of people that are watching that person and understanding, can he take the heat? And then they start to model that behavior. So you have an opportunity to really, lead by example. And I think that's something that I'm very proud that my team was able to do, by not pointing the finger at other teams and being very honest and forthright. And as a result, we got a lot of feedback from other teams that, that was probably the most educational event. Now, you didn't want to repeat that by failing again, at least not in the same way. But it's a way to turn a very negative event into something that's positive and help shape the company's ability to respond to the next big failure. So, Amazon wouldn't support the volume it does if it hadn't been for, hundreds and hundreds of people going through that very same process and helping to expose areas where Amazon could invest in and get more resilient. But that's mine, one of many.
That is amazing. That is amazing. A lot of learnings out there in this incident. Yeah, and how companies should adopt their processes of this is really great example, I think. Yeah.
We've carried that. I've carried that forward into my own startup, and we use it at Quiet as well. I think that that COE process is extremely effective because many times what you look at, especially with new companies, is the same mistakes are made over and over again, and just having those reviews and putting some, shining a light on a dark corner, starts to change the culture and the people by observation and by learning of what not to do. There's no need to fail the same way multiple times in the same company. So I think that's another area that is very effective to take and to use wherever you are in whatever industry you're working in.
Yeah, that's great. So this is a good segue, Charles, for my last question. So, oh, according to you, like, what are the vital skills required to success as a CTO? Let's say if you want to say like top three skills required to as a CTO to become successful in his role, or any
I,
engineering leader to get successful. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think the first thing is you've got to be good from a technical perspective, right? You need to put in that time in the field. I think a lot of engineering managers become managers too quickly. I think there's almost a stigma in some with some people that, hey, I'm not a manager by year 5. I think there's a very strong benefit to keep going back and refreshing those as an individual contributor or in a very technical role. So I'll start with the functional skills are obviously very important. Um, in addition to that, there are a number of others that I'd called out before. It's the skills like recruiting, team building, leadership, um, being a complete leader, and knowing some of the other areas like financial stewardship and product development. But I'll say this: there's a set of traits you need to have as well, things that you can't learn that you must have. Curiosity, toughness, or resilience, right? Drive to do something even when people are telling you no, it's not going to be successful. If you don't have those, it's going to be very difficult to be a CTO, right? The only reason to do this job is really to transform and change an industry. What's the point of doing something where you're going to go out and just do what everyone else has done? To me, that's the definition of mediocrity. So you have to be able to inspire others, and if you can't do that in yourself, and you can't have faith in what you're doing and lead by example, you're going to have serious challenges in this role.
True. That is really great, Charles. Great.
Thank
Fantastic. So thank you so much, Charles. I know we are running out of time now, but there are a lot of things in my the plan. But yes, we covered a lot, and I'm sure our audience would love this conversation. They had a lot of learning from you. So thank you so much, Charles. So great, Charles. Thank you so much, and to my audience, thank you so much for listening. This we are coming up with a more interesting podcast next week. All right. Till the time, see you. Bye.
Thanks, love. Great seeing you 10 years later too.